This morning I'm here with Kate Hellings, who is a master's student in New Zealand and recently contributed to the UN in the topic of women's rights. So I'll leave you to introduce yourself, Kate. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing with yourself at the moment, where you're going, and how you got involved with women's rights topics in the first place?
Of course. Kia ora koutou. My name is Kate, obviously. I am a master's student at the finest tertiary institution in New Zealand, Otago University. I'm doing a master's in politics. I'm looking at issues of national security, but I'm really interested and passionate about women's rights. So I had the fantastic opportunity of applying through United Nations Association of New Zealand and participating in the, it's a mouthful, 65th conference on the status of women. And prior to that, I had won the Be British High Commissioner for the Day, which is a competition run by the British High Commission in New Zealand for International Women's Day. And I've contributed an article towards looking at the reformation of the definition of defences in the New Zealand Crimes Act for Indigenous women who come before the courts as victims of domestic violence. I know victims isn't always the correct terminology, but also perpetrators of crime. So it's something that I'm passionate about, is women's empowerment and participation, but also I'm a student of gender theory as well. So I'm always open to new ideas, but also new frameworks as well. So yeah. That's me.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me today in my this morning and your this evening. I really appreciate your time. And so I thought we could start by discussing a little bit your experiences at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. So how was the event? What kind of contributions were you able to make? And tell me a little bit about the discourse that was going on.
Course. So it's still currently ongoing. So the conference is via Zoom primarily or UN TV, and it runs in conjunction. The main conference runs in conjunction with two other styles of conference. So you have the side events, and then you also have parallel events. So some are run by NGOs, some are run by missions, and then obviously we all come together in the main conference. Now, New Zealand, as a United Nations Association, which is the part that I'm with, I am not directly contributing into the Zoom meetings per se. That's up to the representatives themselves. But I did participate in a hui, which was on last Monday, New Zealand time, which looked at contributing suggestions towards a more empowering framework for women in the public sphere and also in leadership, and as well as contributing solutions, hopefully, as well as discourse about how we reduce gender-based violence. And on top of that, we have representatives who are in a block, I guess is how you would describe it, at the UN, actively participating in trying to pass solutions, memorandums towards empowering women globally as well. So that's kind of what we do and the vibe. I call it the vibe because it's a whole pile of powerful, fantastic, inspiring women doing some phenomenal things. And so I'm just kind of in awe to be here, really. Yeah.
That is really amazing. And maybe you can share with us some of the key points that you've taken away so far from the conference, or some of the most innovative or most creative ideas that you've heard.
So I think the first big theme that's come through in this particular conference, because the focus is on participation and women in leadership, is that it's not enough just to have a few women in leadership positions in one country, but be at a global level and expect change to automatically happen. It's not something that's possible. It requires an equal distribution of women from different cultures, different backgrounds, who are able to bring diverse assets, opinions, lived experience to create change. And I think that's something that has, been a huge theme throughout the main conference. In terms of the parallel events, I think one of the other themes that comes through, and this is through NGOs as well, is that we need to start looking at a more intersectional framework. We can't just continue on the line that we're doing now, which is that you keep repeating the same mistakes. You need to look at, if something isn't working, re-looking at the framework that you're using. And that includes consultation of not only just Indigenous perspectives, but also from minority groups as well. And we need to recognise as well that we can't just continue on a consultation route and then not implementing the change that's been suggested. So looking at how, for example, the experience of certain countries that are considered developing nations, what is their biggest focus versus a country like New Zealand? And I think that's been a really educational experience for me, is actually just listening. It's something that I didn't expect, not necessarily being able to contribute verbally, but just being able to contribute by listening has a huge impact on how I've actually started going about my day-to-day life, which hopefully means that I'm doing something right.
That sounds like a really excellent piece of, self-reflection and self-growth, actually, that you've been able to take away from the conference, which is a really, really cool thing as well. But I also love to hear that it's very much focused on intersectionality. And that's something that I wanted to touch on in this conversation as well, is the kind of the future of, I guess, feminism and of women's rights in New Zealand, and how that future is certainly intersectional, how you think that we can kind of progress towards taking it better into account the perspectives of marginalized women and their communities. Because I think it's clear that over the last 100 years, while we've made enormous strides in women's rights, enormous strides in terms of feminism, it's mostly been strides for wealthier, white, cis women. I personally really see the future of this issue as being one of intersectionality. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's a loaded question. If we could solve it now, I would love to. But I think the first thing I would say is that we need to start taking a collaborative approach. I think sometimes, particularly in leadership, we see women who come through and might be groundbreaking in whatever they do, whatever industry, as competition. So I think we need to take a step back and say, the fact is that there's that age-old saying. I remember it was on an advertisement for the 40-hour famine, and I was about probably 16 at the time, and it said, educate one woman and she will educate 10 more. And I think the thing about this is that we aren't seeing educating one woman and she's educating 10 more. I think we need to start going back to that grassroots approach. So what that means is that when we have huis, when we speak to women from diverse range of backgrounds, and to diverse women as well, we need to actually, particularly as a white woman myself, take a moment and say, okay, I actually just need to listen. And I think from that we can actually grow solutions that require a collaborative approach, but also don't view it as a competition and zero-sum game, you know? And obviously different contexts require different things. So one of the things, I studied law in my undergrad, one of the things that I think in law in New Zealand that we need to do is start actually taking a female perspective to law, right? And that includes looking at, well, how does the law treat women? Is it meeting the needs of women? And then from that, is it meeting the needs of the most marginalized women and vulnerable women who need it most? And I think from an outside of the conference, there's a book, The Feminist Judgments in New Zealand. What this piece of it's like a Bible. It's thick and it's phenomenal in the way in which it actually provides solutions to issues. So one of the things is that we need to start looking at an Indigenous framework. We need to start looking at reparation. If there is a wrong committed against you, how can we right that wrong? Because it's, for example, prison isn't always the best thing to do when someone offends. Often there's underlying issues and we need to get to that source of that issue. And we're not doing that at the moment. And I think if we were to take that example, put it into the UN, that's what we're starting to see now, is that there's actually a desire now to look at what the overarching contributing issue is as to why we have such stagnation and progress. And I can't list off all those issues right off the top of my head, but I can say that they're diverse, and it isn't something that, because it's happening in a nation around me, is not relevant to me, because it 100% is. And it's 100% your responsibility as a female to start sticking up for and making, progress, and whether it's educating yourself, whether it's, advocating for women's rights in whatever sphere you feel comfortable doing, but also I think particularly as a white woman, not speaking over voices of women who are part of minority groups. That's 100% the first step.
I couldn't agree more, and I can see that sometimes it is challenging because when you are a woman or a member of any other minority group, you are used to your own voice not being heard. And if you're given a platform for your voice to be heard, it can be quite challenging sometimes to actually realize that there are others who are heard even less than you, who maybe actually deserve a place on that platform, even more than you do. And it can be quite hard to really take a step back and allow yourself to amplify others' voices instead of this kind of egotistical desire to be the one heard, right? So I think it is really challenging, particularly maybe for women, as a traditionally underprivileged group, to actually recognize the places where we have privilege, recognize areas where we should be listening, as you say, rather than talking. And I really appreciated your point about the justice system. And I'm not sure if you will have thought about this in advance, so no worries if you don't have a clear answer. But do you think that women are particularly victimized in some ways by the justice system in New Zealand? And in particular, do you think that women of minority groups, I'm thinking of course of Maori women, might be victimized and marginalized to a much greater extent within the justice system than white women?
So the obvious answer is yes, I 100% do. So the last statistics that I saw was that 60% of the female prison population in New Zealand were Maori women, right? And that's an unacceptable statistic to have. And one of the things that I think immediately springs to mind, and I mentioned it before, is that one of the things you first learn in criminal justice is that you can't view someone who offends simply as someone who is a bad person. You must look at the root causes of why someone offends. And this is particularly prevalent to women. Women do not tend to offend without there being an underlying cause of this. So I think it comes back to the justice system needing to look at what the needs of women are. And so if we're talking about the Maori context, Maori female context, for example, in the research that I did, there was a lot of underlying issues that start with colonization, for example. And it starts with the justice system being catered to. And that at the time that we were really, founded, so I'm talking about 1840, primarily the people that were going through our first colonial justice system were white men. So that was how the justice system was founded. Now what we're finding is that we have an overabundance in the female context, for example, of Maori women in prison, which shows that the system isn't working. So we need to look at, okay, so if there's colonization, there's poverty. We also know as well that Indigenous women who come before the court as victims of domestic violence, but also perpetrators of crime, there is a reason that they are offending, and it is not going to be solved by putting them into prison. And that requires, I think, an intersectional framework, but also a multi-layer framework. It needs to look at what the causes are, how we can rehabilitate, and how can we create justice through trust as well in our system as a whole, because there have been wrongs committed against Māori, particularly in New Zealand, that stay with us today. And that's also shown through, for example, elections, looking at the rates of political participation. So that's my feelings on it. And do I have a solution? No, but I'm prepared to sit down and listen to Māori women in particular and hear what they see the solution as, because I think as a white woman, the best thing I can do is support and propel their voices forward and say, this is not okay and we need to give these women a platform.
Absolutely. And I just wanted, as well as you were speaking, to contextualize this a little bit for our non-New Zealand audience on Human Rights Pulse, that Maori is the Indigenous group of New Zealand. And that Māori make up roughly 13%, I believe, at the last census of the population. So particularly the statistic you gave, that was it 67%, you say, of women in prison in Māori. That is an absolutely shocking statistic. I mean, if you think about that in comparison to 13% of the wider population, you can really see how overrepresented Māori women are within the prison system. I had heard previously a similar statistic for Māori men, and something that interests me is that it was actually not as bad. which I'm quite surprised by, to be honest. I was shocked when I first heard the statistic, but about 40%, I believe, of the male prison population is represented by Maori men.
I'm not sure what the current statistic is, but
I certainly hope it hasn't worsened since I read it a couple of years ago. But I mean, yeah, so with Maori women that are even more overrepresented in prisons than the Maori population, inclusive of both genders, which is genuinely distressing and shocking. And yeah, of course, as Pākehā women, you and I both, white women for our non-New Zealand audience, it is really important that we can step back and listen to voices who are directly involved in these kind of circumstances, because it's just not an issue that we have really had to face. And I think the interaction between colonialism is always present with every other issue really in New Zealand. Would you agree that, for example, within feminism, there's like you say, there's a colonial background to it. There's a colonial undercurrent that runs underneath the other issues that we can approach in our country.
I think any country that has been colonized, there is going to be effects of colonization. It's just, it's a fact. But it's how we respond to that is the critical issue of us moving forward successfully as a united nation. So I think in terms of gender framework, that is certainly something that we need to start considering more. I know that in politics at Otago, the 100 level, they're now bringing in not only just a feminist framework, but also a framework that looks at the politics of colonization as well. So I'm glad that it's starting to hit the education system a lot harder, because it's now not so much watered down. But B, in high schools, I don't know if you saw recently, we're teaching a more broad spectrum of New Zealand history, not just the parts that suit us. So I think that's a fantastic step forward as a whole for women as well, because I think once you actually get a realistic understanding of how your country is the way it is today, I think then we can actually start addressing some of these issues in a more coherent and inclusive way too.
No, I couldn't agree more. And segueing into the education system, a point that you touched on earlier is how we can't just have a few women in top leadership positions and expect that effect to trickle down all the way through the rest of society and empower all women everywhere, right? And something that I found really interesting is that over time, women have become more and more represented in certain fields of education. In some cases now, women actually represent a higher percentage of that field than men. I think, for example, in law in New Zealand, women now represent over 50% of law graduates. Yet when you look at, for example, Queen's Counsel, if you look at judges, if you look at the partners in law firms, the second you are looking at these top echelons, of course, we're all very familiar with the proverbial glass ceiling and how no matter how many female lawyers we seem to have, the entire legal industry is still being dominated at the top levels by men. So have you heard anything in your recent experiences? Have you come across any more innovative ideas as to how we can start breaking down these barriers? Because I really think the glass ceiling has been something in place for many decades now. And as you say, progress towards removing it has really stagnated. So I'm looking for something a little bit more innovative at this point than simply encouraging more women to go into STEM.
Yeah. I find right now, for example, you look at New Zealand Parliament, and in government, we have, I think, just on 50% equal representation. I'll need to be fact checked on that. One of my concerns is that we're going to start, and this is in the private sector, relying on quotas. See, I think the issue actually lies in societal expectations and societal perceptions about women. A quota does not necessarily get rid of that stigmatization of women, and it doesn't get rid of the fact that you walk into a room and you might be looked at because you're the only female in the room, and you don't want, and I don't think that that's necessarily going to help all the time. I think what we need to look at, as well as quotas, is education, but also need to start looking at those women that are in power now. I definitely think we should be like having some mentorship, or and this is not just from, I think, grad level. We've, like you say, we've got these graduates, we've got these female graduates entering into the workforce, but a mentorship program that helps women into leadership positions. And when I say helped women into leadership positions, it's about women providing a support system for women. So it's not you getting into a leadership position because you're a woman, but it's you getting into a leadership position because you are given the skills that are required to lead, and to lead healthily as well is a key thing for me. I think we can see women in leadership positions who just work night and day, and I want to see a world in which you don't have to go through burnout to be a good leader. You are leading through good mental health policy, through good leadership that includes people from all sorts of diverse backgrounds as well. And I think that's something that I would be really excited to see. And I think as well, we're doing a phenomenal thing at the moment with our graduate programs in university, at least, with looking at workshops that start helping all people being able to hone their leadership skills from a young age. So I think that's what's going to help too. But also, we can't stop seeing women in leadership, because I think one of the things we saw in the recent US election was, and this is something that stuck with me, was Vice President Harris saying that she was so blown away that women felt empowered just seeing her. And I think that's something as well, is that when we have female leaders, be visible, let people see you, because I think that inspires other women as well. So that's my sort of take on that at the moment.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I have to say, we are very privileged in this regard at the moment in New Zealand, of course. I mean, we have Jacinda Ardern, our amazing Prime Minister, who has really received sort of global recognition for her leadership through the pandemic, as well as her leadership through the Christchurch shooting and the many crises, in fact, that she's weathered as the Prime Minister of New Zealand. But it doesn't just stop there. We also have Nanaia Mahuta, who is an absolutely incredible Maori foreign minister. For our non-New Zealand audience who may not know her, we have other prominent politicians. The leader of our opposition party is also a woman. We have Chloe Swarbrick, Golriz Garaman, who are some Green MPs who are my personal heroes. So I think that we have at the moment,
with you, of course. Just teasing.
Of course. So we have an absolute abundance of genuinely inspirational women, and women coming from such diverse backgrounds as well. For example, Golriz Garaman, who was an asylum seeker as a child in New Zealand, and whose family fled from Iran during the Iranian war. So I think that in New Zealand, we are so lucky to, at this moment in time, have an amazing array of women with diverse experiences, diverse backgrounds, diverse perspectives, who we can look up to in a parliamentary setting. And yet, even with all of these inspirational women, as you say, the statistics in terms of how many female MPs make up our parliament is sitting just around the halfway mark, right? It might not even be quite 50%.
Yeah, I think it's just below 50%. I keep looking down, wanting to look at my phone to double check that, but I'm pretty sure it's sitting around the high 40s.
Yeah, and of course, that's a huge positive step in the sense that it used to be sitting around 0. And an increase from 0 to high 40s is clearly a good thing. Yet women make up 50% of the global population, actually 51%, just purely because men tend to die slightly younger than women. We are actually overrepresented in the global population as a whole.
I didn't know that's why 51%, but there you go. There you go.
So one thing that I'm kind of interested in is actually overrepresentation as a tool to really kind of address this chronic underrepresentation that we have seen for women in positions of power for centuries, if not for millennia. And there was something that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, also a hero of mine, said once, and I'm going to paraphrase her since this is not an exact quote, but she was asked at one point how many women she thinks would be suitable to sit on the Supreme Court, or rather, how many women she thinks would need to be sitting on the Supreme Court for the US justice system to have truly achieved equality. And she said 9. There, of course, being 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And the interviewer responded in a slightly surprised way, and she said, yes, everyone is always surprised when I make that point, but there have been 9 male justices for most of US history, and no one has ever questioned that. So I wonder if you think that perhaps we should be aiming for a slightly higher benchmark than 50% representation of women, because for most of history, we've seen nearly 100% representation of men.
I'm not sure, because I I haven't really thought about overrepresentation of women. I guess maybe that's because it's so far-fetched to me, given our current
it seems unbelievable, doesn't it? And yet Ruth makes a good point. We've never once questioned the overrepresentation of men. Why is it that the overrepresentation of a minority group seems so far-fetched?
I think that for us to achieve true equality, I believe that we need to work with men.
Oh, of course.
And I think overrepresentation, I don't like that word. Ideally, in an ideal world, you'd have 9 female justices because they were the best women for the job. So when I hear the RBG quote, I always think, if there's 9 women on there because they're the most qualified lawyers, they've done some boss-ass stuff for the legal system, I would not be angry. And that goes for Parliament as well. If you have over 50% female representation and you see meaningful policy being passed, because this is the other thing, tokenistic representation, to me, it's just not helping, and it's not helpful because it doesn't give women that equal seat at the table, because it really doesn't, right? Because you'll say something that's nice, nothing changes. So if there's going to be overrepresentation, and I don't like the word, because I think if there is overrepresentation, it's because women need to be there, and whatever skills they're bringing to the table, it's because it's needed. And so if, like you say, we've got 9 female chief justices on the US Supreme Court, I'll be the first person reading those judgments, you can assure you of that. But also I'll celebrate a world where the gender doesn't matter.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that would ultimately be the goal in an ideal world of this kind of overrepresentation, to use the word that you're not such a fan of, is not it's not the concept of having a quota of more than 50% of this particular position should be filled by women. It would rather be exactly as you say, about actually reaching a point in time where, not necessarily always, but at least some of the time, more than 50% of the candidates for a position happen to be women, and they happen to be the most qualified people in the room, because we've really achieved a feeling of equality which runs much deeper into society, and where women from the ground up are actually able to express themselves in a public space with the same fullness and the same potential as men, which is not currently the world that we exist in.
I think terminology matters, and that's why I sort of drew up on the overrepresentation. I think when it comes to gender equality and female empowerment, and this goes for empowerment for all minority groups, I like to be careful of the terminology I use, because I don't want, to me, overrepresentation is negative because it seems like there's undeserving people there. And I think that the society I want to live in is that every single person that's in that boardroom, that's sitting in Parliament, that sits on that bench, whatever it is a deserving person. And so when it comes to, and I think this is something that we're seeing now in the rise of social media as well, words matter, terminology matters, and actions have always mattered. But I think now more than ever, when what you say is more accessible, I am very careful and also respectful of the terminology that we use. And I think that's also something that I've been learning at the UN conference as well, is that we are speaking in so many different languages. So when we use words, we need to be very, very careful linguistically of what that means to other people. And I think, for example, with New Zealand, we do need to start using more te reo in everyday language. That's the Indigenous language of New Zealand. It's also an official language of New Zealand as well. And I think there are some concepts that, you can't translate. And one of the things that I think for me is that whenever there's a new concept that's brought up at CSW, so that's the acronym, I want to know what that means, and I want to see if I can bring that into my everyday language. And one of the words I think I want to phase out is overrepresentation, because I feel like it's, for me, something that has that negative connotation. We can just have representation, and I'm excited to see and bring in some new terminology into my language every day as well. But I think for me, you can never, the day we have 9 Supreme Court justices, heck, I'll be opening a bottle of red and celebrating with all my friends.
Amazing. And so I wanted touch on one last question with you today. I won't take up too much more of your time. I know it's getting late in the evening for you. But I wanted to also touch on the gender pay gap.
Okay.
Very incendiary topic, I know. A lot of people don't even really believe that there is a gender pay gap, or they think it can be debunked in some way. Personally, I've read into the topic a great deal, and statistically speaking, I do believe that it exists. Well, I don't believe that it exists, it simply does. It can be seen and, it can be kind of determined economically speaking. But then there is this debate of how do we go about reducing it? What kind of policies can be put in place, or what kind of social change needs to happen in order to see that women are actually earning the same pay as men for jobs where they are equally qualified. And I wondered if you have any thoughts on that as well.
So the first thing I'd say about the gender pay gap is that, one, it does exist. And so I don't adhere to that argument that it doesn't. The second thing, just want to put that one right out there. The second thing is that there's a lot of work that women do that goes unpaid. So in the domestic sphere, for example, looking after children, doing things in your household, for example, are unpaid. So when we look at the gender pay gap, one of the things we have to remember is that right now, women take up a significant portion of unpaid work. And one of the policies that I think is really, really great for the gender pay gap is in New Zealand is having equal parental leave. That means that there is, one, the family unit is prioritised, because I think that the family unit being prioritised, raising children, whether it's a single parent household or not, is so important for humans as just a species. But by having an equal parental leave, it means that there's no excuse at all in the private sphere. And we've seen these excuses before, evidentially, that, oh, well, a woman's going off to have a family. Oh, well, she's not working as many hours because she's got to go look after the kids or whatever. And that, for me, is a phenomenal step in the right direction. Now, the next step from that is, again, social change. I think I personally advocate for, and I know that teachers are already under stress, so there would need to be we need to be bringing out more teachers, but B, I think an education policy that nullifies these myths about gender and about what, whose role is where, whose roles in the private sphere, whose roles in the public sphere, just nullifying it from the outset. Because once you start creating a society that doesn't accept sexism or misogyny, doesn't accept racism, doesn't accept homophobia from the outset, then these issues like the gender pay gap start to no longer exist. And I maybe that's naive of me, but that's the type of idealism that I see. And I think education is the best way forward personally. Now, I know that there's probably a whole pile of other theories about how to fix it, but I definitely think paid parental leave gets rid of that domestic excuse from the outset. I think education's the way forward. And I genuinely believe that if you don't believe that there's a gender pay gap, then you're clearly not reading statistical evidence. And I 100% recommend you get in on those statistics, because what I think a lot of people miss is that there is enough evidence to show it now that we can't deny it, and it's a redundant argument to deny it, and we need to put all that energy into fixing the problem.
I totally agree. And do you think that there's a way that we can kind of make it more clear to people who, quite often, unfortunately, men who are kind of approaching this issue with these pseudoscientific arguments about why there isn't really a gender pay gap, or why the gender pay gap is only a result of women choose not to go into high-paying fields of work, or women choose to work less hours, and this is why they're earning less than men. It's actually because of something which is their own choice. How do you think that we can go about combating these arguments and actually making it clear that this is an issue for everyone? Because I've always seen it as being an equal issue for men. I mean, if it is true that the gender pay gap is in a large part resultant of women doing more of the care work in the home, isn't this also something which is problematic for men? Wouldn't they also like to live in a society where they're encouraged to develop a relationship with their child which is just as strong as the mother's relationship with the child? Wouldn't they rather live in a society where equal parenting and co-parenting is the norm? So how do you think that we can go about, and this I think is an issue across the whole spectrum of issues related to gender, is sometimes a bit of one of misrepresentation, or One where it begins to feel like a zero-sum game where women are trying to fight against men in some way. And that's really just not how it is, right? It's like about creating a society where the genders are equal and all genders are equal as well, not just binary genders, and where that society is one where every individual is able to flourish and able to benefit from the equality that exists. How do you think that we can go about framing this as something which is a men's issue just as much as it is a woman's issue?
I sit in this sort of ivory tower because I'm still at university.
Mm-hmm.
I remember at a conference I was at, I was ridiculed because I said, I think the solution comes from working from home. And this at the conference, I was ridiculed by a particular visiting speaker. And I actually think
Has it a guess that speaker might have been male?
Actually, no,
Really?
it was a female. Yeah, no, it was a female. And I think for me, I can smile a wee bit because what we're seeing is that during COVID-19, and maybe this is one small positive in a very, very dark situation, is that you don't have to work an 80-hour week, for example, to get the same workload done. We've seen people working from home actually being able to, other than essential services that have to physically be there, that have been able to continue to work in a productive manner from home in less hours. We've also seen a trend of people working, finishing early, going, males as well, going to pick up their family or spend time with family and still being able to work from home and produce the same quality output. So I think the first thing I would say is that if COVID-19 has shown anything, it's that we can work remotely. And that has shown as well that in certain industries, there's been productivity increasing. So I would probably point to that. The second argument that I would bring to the table as well is that there are many men who, and this is also given the opportunity to spend time with family or have given the option to spend less time in the office and more time working from home, have taken that opportunity and haven't been economically punished for it. So I think that's the next piece of evidence, is that I don't want to combat necessarily from a female perspective, but show a male experience as well, which are those two things too. The third thing as well is that I think there are some times where you just have to physically present the evidence before someone. You have to show the genuine statistics as they stand. And I think Hollywood's a prime example of comparing male leads to female leads. And when someone doesn't accept that, taking a step back and saying, okay, that's 100% fine, but I don't want to engage in this anymore, because I've presented those factual statistics. I've presented to you the argument from, if it's a male perspective, to a male, from a male perspective, and that person at some point, and I genuinely believe this, will find that argument with the right statistics convincing. Because I think that's the other thing, is that with misinformation, when we present statistics, there's a counter. There's always going to be a counter to suit someone else's argument. So providing a very solid argument and then saying, okay, I've done what I can, and then walking away is often just as powerful, and saying I'm not going to engage in this anymore.
There's a point where ignorance turns into willful ignorance, right? And that's the point where it's no longer productive to continue the conversation.
100%. And I think as well, there's so many different scenarios that have been presented that I've seen, particularly on social media, where people have been trying to combat this for years, really. And I don't have any better solutions than they do, other than sometimes I do have to walk away. And I know that seems like a defeatist attitude, but I actually think it's more powerful. It's saying I'm not going to engage in this argument anymore because it's simply not worth my time. And I think sometimes that is the key, is that sometimes walking away from something when it isn't equal, when it isn't fair, is actually a very powerful statement, and your actions actually equate more than your words.
No, I couldn't agree more. It's a really, really good point. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you, and it was really informative and enlightening for me. So I hope that you've also enjoyed getting your opinions out there a little bit. And good luck with the rest of the conference. I hope that it continues to be a very informative and instructive experience.
Yeah.
And also with the rest of your master's degree.
Thank you so much. And thank you as well to your magazine and to you for reaching out as well. You guys are doing some phenomenal work, and I've actually had the opportunity to read a few articles, and what you're doing is super important. So thank you again for giving me the opportunity for voice. Yeah, and I hope good luck with the. We are living in a pandemic, so good luck with the pandemic. I'm sure there's heaps of Netflix shows we can all watch as well.
Thank you very much. Well, have a nice rest of the evening and hopefully speak again soon.
Sounds good. See you later.
Kia ora.